Many believe life as we know it has changed irrevocably, and that in this seismic shift lies an opportunity to turn things around, improve our world, and make life better for the majority, especially in poor countries. It is time to reboot Nigeria. This is Pivotal. Even before the COVID-19 pandemic, Nigeria was already facing food security challenges arising from the effect of climate change, a struggling economy, and violent conflicts and crimes that impacted agriculture and food production. Then came COVID-19 and the economic disruption to the global economy, further exacerbating an already precarious situation. Although agriculture is the largest sector of the Nigerian economy and employs 2/3 of the entire labor force, food production has also not kept pace with the population growth. With farmers unable to work the land for fear for their lives, and importers struggling with high foreign exchange rates affecting the price of imported foods, Nigeria may be gradually heading towards major food shortages. Experts predicted that in addition to the danger it poses to health, COVID was likely to exacerbate existing problems and lead to major economic disruption, and may eventually lead to civil unrest, some even say food riots. Over the last few months, prices of food commodities have surged. Food inflation rose to 22.95% in March, caused by wide-ranging price increases across items such as cereals, yam, meat, fish, and fruits. According to Bloomberg, a media company specializing in economic and financial news, 91.1% of Nigerians cannot afford a healthy diet. So, how bad is the situation in Nigeria really? And is it still salvageable? These are some of the questions we'll be discussing on Pivotal today. I'm joined by Mr. Abubakar Suleiman, the Assistant Representative Programs at the Food and Agricultural Organization of the United Nations, and Mr. Nana Ude, a board member of the Nigeria Economic Summit Group, an economic think tank and policy advocacy group, and also CEO of Argon Continental Limited. Gentlemen, welcome to Pivotal.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much, Valeria, for having me.
Okay. Now, let me start with you, Mr. Abubakar Suleiman, because your organization has just released a report on the Nigeria food situation. How bad is it?
Thank you once again. Let me say, to clarify one thing, okay. The report that was released was actually released by the government of Nigeria. The FAO has actually provided technical support in organizing and collecting data and supporting the analysis of the reports. To go back to the question, Nigeria currently, the analysis focused on the food insecurity hotspots. So it's not a national representative analysis, so to speak, but it focuses on 16 key states that are facing severe to acute food insecurity problems. And in the March-April analysis, the results showed that more than 9.2 million people, representing about 9.3% of the analyzed population, require urgent food assistance.
Are you able to talk to us a little bit more about those 16 states and the circumstances that have led to this state of emergency for the population that you're focusing on?
Yeah, largely the states are focused in the north of Nigeria, specifically in the northeast of Nigeria, which has had to deal with a decade-long insurgency, and also states in the northwest of the country, which has had to also grapple with rising levels of banditry and kidnappings. And lastly, the states in the north central parts of the country, which also face other forms of shock, including the farmer-herder conflict. So these are the major states in the analysis, including the Federal Capital Territory.
And these states appear to also be the states that predominantly produce the large bulk of the food that is consumed in Nigeria. So even though you did not do an analysis across the country, would we be right in saying that the state of those states will ultimately have an impact on the wider issue of food security across the country?
Indeed, you're very correct. The northern half of the country contributes substantially to the internal local food production of Nigeria, particularly for cereals, for livestock, and also for agro-perishable foods, including vegetables, to some extent also meat and dairy.
Let me bring in Mr. Nenna Ude here. I know that as part of the Economic Summit Group annual conference that held last year, the issue of food security was one of the things that you dealt with. You've now heard some of the data as explained by Malam Abubakar Suleiman. Are you at all surprised by the severity of the situation?
Thank you for having me in this program. We are not surprised at all by what the data is saying. Because if you look at the previous NESG macroeconomic outlook reports, we kind of forecasted the situation where we are in now. And what the data tells us more, if you look at the trends, and it just didn't happen overnight. If you look at the trends with respect to food inflation, like you pointed out, January 2019, it was 13.51%. By March 2021 is 22.95%. April is now 22.72%. Again, with food production, agri production with respect to the GDP, you will see that the numbers are going down. You also look at, very importantly, at food imports, because these are all indicators that tell you where we are heading to with respect to food security. Food imports bill have jumped up from 352 billion first quarter of 2019 to 797 billion in the fourth quarter of last year. So that means we are spending more on importing food. And so the trends really have been quite clear in where we are heading to. And so what we need to begin to think about now is how do we reverse the trends? But also food distribution, because when you try to create the linkage between what's going on in the north and the entire country, you will find that the major challenge as it relates to insecurity is also with food production distribution, because we use largely our roads to move food from one part of the country, and the level of insecurity we experience, not just in the farms, but on our roads, also affect the way we distribute food across the country. So that is also leading to high levels of food insecurity across the country. So it's not just with the farm, but also with the roads that move the food around.
Okay, let me ask Mr. Suleiman now. I mean, if we listen there to Mr. Ude, given that this was expected, predictable, and also predicted, why do you think we've been unable to roll out strategies to mitigate what we are seeing now? Or is it a question of there was an inevitability and there was really nothing anyone could have done to stop this from taking place?
To be honest, I would slightly disagree with you that it is largely predictable. I think in your introduction, you've made mention of COVID as a pandemic, and I think it has contributed largely to the present food insecurity situation of the country. So nobody could have better predicted the outcome of COVID. But I think...
Isn't it true, before you go further, isn't it true that the minute, though, that people knew we were facing a pandemic, they essentially, experts said that pandemics tend to come with three things. They come with health challenges, they come with issues around social cohesion, they come with economic problems. And if you looked at all of those three things, inevitably, these are some of the aftermath of those trainings. So even if we didn't know COVID was coming, once COVID came, it was predicted that we could get here.
Yeah, you are right. I think essentially the major question to be asked would have been perhaps, how did we react to COVID? And I think our reaction to COVID globally not only in Nigeria, could have been better. And I think the major impact of a reaction to COVID has had, of course, significant impact on not only food production or food distribution or access to food in general, but also overall, it has a major impact on the food systems. Reactions like movement restrictions means that the movement of goods, particularly food, from the location of production to the location of consumption was affected. There could have been some sort of measures to minimize the impact of restriction on particularly foods and food-related items. Now, access to input for production, as Mr. Ude had said, had also been impacted because large part of input needed to drive agricultural production are import dependent. And there was a total import restriction on a lot of things during the lockdown. We've also seen already issues that were pre-existing COVID, like infrastructure issues, power issues, or infrastructure linked to cold chain, for example, were not largely available. So the restrictions and the reactions to COVID means that agro-perishables there would be significant increase in food losses and food wastages because we don't have capacity to preserve perishable food items. And also access to much needed extension services that has been largely manual based. Even though we have perhaps digital solutions, if we had taken action to see COVID probably as an opportunity to improve digital agricultural solutions, particularly access to training, extension services, or even trade in food and input, perhaps we could have minimized the outcome. And then lastly, also, the reallocation of resources meant to support agri and other food security interventions going on in the country has to be reallocated directly to finance public health responses. So I think these are issues that maybe we could have done better somehow, but these are things that normally there is a lot of uncertainty around the disease itself and how it manifests. And I think it's only recently the epidemiological nature and pattern of the disease is beginning to be realized. And this largely sometimes I would say maybe inevitable, but perhaps with better data, better planning, and better implementation, we could have managed largely the impact.
Mr. Ude, in many ways, what Nigeria is facing at the moment seems to be what people might call a perfect storm, because in addition to some of the issues that have been enumerated by Malam Suleiman, we have also seen unemployment and underemployment numbers, at record highs. Unemployment rate, 33.3%. I'm looking at some numbers here. This is also on the employment rate of 22.8 among young people aged between 15 to 34 years. The unemployment rate rises to 42.5%. And so when you look at all of these things combined with some of the challenges that were enumerated by Malam Suleiman, we seem to be in a position where our situation is really dire. Add the issue of insecurity, like you've mentioned, the inability to move things around this country, the fact that people cannot go to the farm. It doesn't look very good. Is it salvageable?
Well, wearing my national optimistic hat, I am supposed to say that it is salvageable. But we must also admit that we have had to wade through a couple of perfect storms. Each time you think that, yes, this will make it happen, and then it doesn't make it happen, and we wait until we open the next chapter of crisis. Maybe we need to get to a tipping point, and then we will then begin the slow ride.
Is it a governance and policy issue?
To a very large extent, I will say yes, because it's not as if the solutions haven't been out there. We have, whether it is at the National Nigerian Economic Summit level or different think tanks across, have laid out policy prescriptions to move us away from this perfect storm, as I had said in the past. But I think more when you talk about governance, my challenge really is with coordination.
Mr. Ude, I'm going to ask you to just stop there for a minute while we take a quick break. And when we come back, we continue the conversation on the solutions that are possible. Don't go away. Welcome back to Pivotal, where we're talking about food security in Nigeria. Mr. Ude, before the break, you started talking to us about what you think the potential solutions are to this looming disaster. So what exactly should we be doing?
With regards to where we are now, we are currently in a state of crisis. And I remember saying to someone right after the NSAS protest that if we are not careful, the next round of national protests we'll have will be triggered by a food crisis. My take is that given where we are now, we don't have the luxury of putting forward medium to long-term solutions. So we need to begin to think of what to do in the immediate in order to reverse the current trends where we are in. And I suggest that we should deploy what I call strategic security measures to high food production areas that are not yet vulnerable to the high levels of threats of insecurity that we currently have in other parts of the country. I also think that we should begin to create food transport corridors and provide security along those corridors. And to that point, you know that in war situations, the United Nations usually create a humanitarian corridor in order to move humanitarian aid. We might begin to think about identifying where our food transport corridors are and ensuring that we have security along those corridors. Then I will want us to see stronger collaboration between agencies that are in the security architecture and agencies that are within the food protection ecosystem, so that they can share information around what because currently the biggest challenge we have is traced to insecurity. Yes, we are contending with the aftershocks of the pandemic. Yes, we are contending with climate change, but the most immediate threat we have now are threats of insecurity, bandit attacks, and all that. So we should first begin to look at that. And if we can build a closer synergy between what the security agencies are doing and what they are doing within the food production ecosystem, that can help in better information sharing and deploying solutions for the immediate, while we begin to still build ourselves back to short-term and medium-term measures that can address this situation.
Mr. Suleiman, what Mr. Nana is saying to me kind of makes sense if you consider how long it's taking us to resolve sort of what might be our biggest issue in the Northeast. It is not likely that we're going to see the back of insecurity in other places rather quickly. So what do you make of his ideas on creating corridors for distributing food, finding areas where insecurity is not too high and perhaps securing them for production? And in addition to that, what else should we be looking at if you agree with his ideas?
Yeah, thank you. I think what I would do, to Nena's point, is to put some framing into the approach. They are largely practical and in some way surgical. If I were to give you example, for instance, with the Northeast, where there is a lot of talk about the insurgency and how that has affected food production and food security in general. It is still possible that agriculture can work in those areas. Food can still be produced even under emergency situation. We need to just try to see how. And for me, the how would lie on identifying areas that are still accessible, and there are. In the Northeast, the states worst affected, Adamawa, Borno, and Yobe, have about 67 local government areas. Not all of them are inaccessible. You know, in Adamawa, there is only what we call the 4 M's: Madagali, Michika, Mubi North and Mubi South LGS that are largely partially inaccessible. In Yobe, there is only the 3Gs, Gujba, Gulani, and Gaidam LGAs that are largely inaccessible. It's in Borno that you have a large LGAs that would have challenges in full access. What it means is that the vast majority of the LGAs, you can still produce food, at a scale that will put a meaningful dent to food insecurity. The second approach is that there are other areas that are largely safe, stable, and what can we do? We can upscale, we can optimize the utility of land, we can optimize the utility of resources, we can work towards also reduction in food wastes and food losses. In areas where there are stable production, there are also high levels of post-harvest losses and also food wastes. So what are we doing in terms of building capacities to make sure that we minimize to a tolerable level food wastes and food losses, be it in the storage, in processing, on farm, in production? We need that. And there are areas that could do better in certain specific commodities. How are we prioritizing that?
Often when we have these conversations, Nana, for whatever reason, we always look to the center. With this particular problem, are we looking at solutions from the center, or should we be looking at solutions that also involve subnationals? And in particular, I am interested in also having a conversation around malnutrition, which, as you know, has also long-term consequences in the sense that children between the ages of 0 and 5 who end up without the right nutrition also grow up to be adults who have issues around formation and brain power, and all of this in the end has an impact on how we develop. So over to you.
Yeah, we have for a long time been in a trap whereby the economic model that we have designed is tied to the governance structure that we have, and then it instantly creates a large pool of vulnerable citizens because everybody is looking to the center, everybody is looking to the top. A community-driven approach to development is simply a pathway to begin to address that. And so, yes, you are right. Looking to the federal government for this policy to be implemented will not deliver it. As a matter of fact, even looking to the state governments to do that will not also deliver it, which is why a number of us are advocating that if we are able to strengthen the capacity of the local government to be able to focus on issues around this, dealing with the vulnerable citizens. Now, we talk about food production and distribution and nutrition. Things like rural roads, creating rural access to farms within the rural areas. It's not what you will expect a federal government to do. It's not what a state government should do. If we capacitate the local government areas to do community-led, community development approach or programs, then you will be in a position to, in a micro level, design programs for the vulnerable, whether it is in malnutrition, whether it is in healthcare or rural access to the farms. We can begin to do that. But unfortunately, our inability to build that capacity at the local level is what has led us to create this large army of malnourished children who you have said will ultimately grow up to become adults.
Let me ask Mr. Abubakar Suleiman for a final take on this situation. And what are your final thoughts on essentially how we can tackle what is, again, a looming disaster?
I would say essentially there are a number of roles for everyone, not necessarily the center or the subnationals. I should say that there is role for a large fraction of the stakeholders, including the private sector, including the government, the international partners, and the communities. But by and large, as I keep saying, we need to recognize and identify in some way the centrality of food security. That would enable us to fit into issues of nutrition, issues of climate mitigation, issues of climate adaptation, issues of peace building around pillars of agriculture, of food security.
Mr. Ude, just your final thoughts on what Nigeria must do as a matter of urgency if we are to halt this slide into essentially large-scale hunger in the country.
I would like to see, and I keep emphasizing this point, stronger collaboration within government agencies. If the CBN is investing in any commodity or within intervention schemes, I would like to see that they are working closely with not just the Ministry of Agriculture, but with the private sector to ensure that these interventions are going in areas where we are able to upscale and get the desired productivity that we want. Because sometimes what you see is one agency is focusing on one area, another agency is moving in another direction, and they are not speaking to themselves. So I really would like, at a time like this, let's sing from the same hymn sheet, because we really can no longer afford a situation where we are dissipating our efforts and energy in different directions. We need a multi-stakeholder approach. We need a multi-stakeholder alliance in addressing this. And everybody must come together to realize that we are at a crisis point, and this is not a time for anybody to want to prove that he is the only one pushing it. All stakeholders must be in the room, collaborate, talk to each other, and move in the same direction, and we'll be able to surmount it.
Gentlemen, I'm afraid we've run out of time, and so we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you so much for joining us on Pivotal. Mr. Abubakar Suleiman, the Assistant Representative Programs at the Food and Agricultural Organization of the United Nations, and Mr. Nana Ude, a board member of the Nigeria Economic Summit Group, an economic think tank and policy advocacy group. Join us again next month for another edition of Pivotal.